Immediate fallout from the United States Grand Prix, with Red Bull Racing in some trouble. But Scott, what did they do, and were they cheating?
Well, this is such a fascinating story because it's the perfect kind of F1 thing that you could argue is a storm in a teacup, not actually something of substance, but it is incredibly intriguing and it does hark to a slightly bigger picture. And the best part about it is that it emerged from something that seemed like not a non-story, but a smaller story. We knew that Red Bull had faced some kind of issue because faced a steward summons because of some kind of issue on the grid technically, but really around the start phase of the race, that after the formation lap had begun. What happened is that a Red Bull team member broke the rules around everybody being off the grid and then not coming back onto it. They weren't actually trying to get on the grid itself, but basically there's an opening in the pit wall, and so basically what they were doing was sort of encroached into what's called the gate well area, which is where that opening is, after the pit marshals basically said no one's allowed here anymore because the formation lap had started. That in itself was kind of low-level interest and a bit weird, but nothing more than that, until we found out last night at the track, and you can read all about it on the website, what they were doing, which was they were targeting the tape that McLaren put on the pit wall to help Lando Norris with his starts.
Well, there's a lot of detail for us to get into in terms of whether they were allowed to do it or not, but can you explain a little bit more about what that tape is there for? Give us the tail of the tape, to misuse a phrase.
Yeah, so the reason that this is relevant, and the reason why Red Bull might want to go after it, and we'll get into that more in a second, is basically it's a technique or method, whatever you want to call it, that McLaren and Norris have used for quite some time. I think from the start of this season they clarified that whether they could do this. In F1, everybody obviously, at the end of the formation lap, you roll into your grid spot and you line up as far forward as possible. Every now and again, we do get the occasional penalty for a driver who goes too far, so they start out of position. F1's all about marginal gain, so everyone's looking for the final millimetres, or sometimes centimetres, but usually millimetres basically, to make sure that you're starting as far forward as possible. But visibility is really hard from the cockpit of these cars. So McLaren aren't the only team that have adopted a technique around this. Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari do something slightly different with some tape on the cockpit of the car. But what Norris and McLaren do is they put this big strip of tape on the nearest pit wall to Norris's car, which in Austin was basically right next to him on the left-hand side on the pit wall. And Norris's car is basically wheeled into the position before the formation lap begins as part of that whole gridding up procedure. They put the tape on, and then Norris has a fixed reference point. So from what he can see in the car, he can see the tape. He knows when he comes back in at the end of the formation lap, he lines the car up there. He's in a good position. Norris, remember, got a time penalty, Bahrain this year, for being slightly out of position. So it's very easy to fall foul of. Other drivers have done it too. And that is basically what Red Bull, as we understand it, have been targeting a couple of times. This is not the first time that Red Bull have made a move for someone else's marker in this position. I'm not sure if it's someone else other than McLaren doing it, but it's definitely happened to McLaren before. And one of the interesting things about this is that because they knew that this was a bit of a target, they actually reinforced the way they put the tape on this time, and it made it harder to get the tape off.
This is absolutely classic Formula One shenanigans, fun and games. Now, actually messing with the tape is not specifically illegal. As you've explained, it was a procedural breach that they were done for. But obviously, McLaren are irritated, and people will start throwing around this phrase of the spirit of the regulations, the spirit of the game, etc. Now, they could have been done on one of what I call the catch-all regulations. There is one about sporting behaviour, or unsporting behaviour, rather. So why do you think that wasn't utilised to give them a tougher penalty?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to stress, while there's no doubt at all, as I understand it within the FIA and certainly McLaren, that this is what the Red Bull team member was trying to do, in terms of hard evidence, what has been seen is that the team member goes for something on the pit wall, but in terms of the resolution enough to see whether they were specifically trying to remove some tape or something, that couldn't definitively be shown. But there are no question marks, as I say, within the FIA or McLaren, that this is what the target was. The other thing is, you can't know what the intent was, so playing it up as this, horrific, against sporting ethics, bringing things into disrepute, misdeed, would be wrong. That would be over the top. You're right. It plays into those classic F1 grey areas, the dark arts. There's another word for it in English as well, and that's frowned upon depending on your view of what's allowed and what isn't. As you say, spirit of the rules, but what it does play into is, this little bit of needle over trying to find some kind of sporting edge, because it's not about Red Bull gaining anything from that apart from making it slightly more difficult for McLaren and Norris to do their job. It reminds me of, do you remember in 2021 with Mercedes and Red Bull when that title fight was going on, got to a point where there's like an unwritten rule, isn't there, in F1, where you move out the way at pit stops and you move equipment out the way, the wires that hang down from pit back gantries and that kind of thing. And basically Mercedes and Red Bull stopped being overly helpful with each other. So it's a bit more in that kind of thing. Red Bull just trying to disturb their direct or nearest opposition at the start.
Yeah, and there will be people watching this. Some of you probably angry about it and think it's against the spirit of the rules, spirit of cricket, the spirit of the game, Corinthian spirit, all of those phrases for something nebulous. All that really matters is what's in the regulations. Now, teams can decide how they behave and what they do. There is now a bit of a line in the sand with this as well, because it will have been talked about. So if it were to happen again, I imagine there would be a more extreme sanction beyond just triggering the fine. But you can't always just reach for this kind of nebulous spirit of the regulations thing, because there are things that teams all do which you could argue do not fit in that. And normally the spirit of the regulations argument is not rooted in anything. It's everybody's different perspective, and normally it's whoever's got a little bit more power in the debate gets to decide. And that's why I don't think it's a particularly productive scene. But it's classic Formula One shenanigans, isn't it? Not a massive advantage or gain, but it might mean Norris isn't lined up properly in the grid slot. It might just irritate him and distract him a little bit when he gets back round for that start procedure. So it's just the classic thing that teams do, and it's up to you whether you do it. I personally wouldn't do it, but if somebody did it against me, I'd be annoyed like McLaren were. But that you don't, it's not something you lose a Grand Prix victory over.
No, and as we've sort of hinted at in different ways, like how you view it is subjective. What we don't know is sort of where this came from within Red Bull. We don't know, beyond the fact that it's definitely happened at least once before. We don't know if this has been going on all season. This has been a new thing. We don't know whether the instruction to do it's come from on high, whether or not it's been an individual acting in the moment or a little cabal of mechanics or something like that. Because it's like no harm, no foul, basically. So it's difficult to discern sort of where it comes from. I know that there are some people who believe that whether this has been more like of a mandated thing from the team or an individual act, there's a bit of a feeling of like, it speaks to a culture at Red Bull that at McLaren, for example, they don't believe in. So McLaren feel very strongly that there is a right way to go racing. They talk about that quite a lot. Earlier this year when there was more needle with Red Bull and the former team boss Christian Horner, that came up quite a lot in conversations with McLaren in private, but also in public. So you're right, it really does fall on whether or not you think that this kind of thing is acceptable. I'll be curious to see if Red Bull do anything about it now that this is out in the open. It'd be interesting to speak to Lauren Mekies in Mexico, the next race that we go to in a few days, to see if he was aware of it, if he doesn't think there's anything to it, if any corrective action has been taken or deemed necessary. So yeah, that's quite a curious development as well.
It's just a great example of the lengths that teams will go to in this kind of competition. Max Verstappen now really is in that Drivers' Championship fight. So every marginal gain that you can find, anything you can do to inconvenience your opposition within what the rules actually say, people will look at. And it comes down to how you go about your business of going racing. McLaren don't like it. Red Bull, I imagine, will probably publicly denounce it later on. But I know for a fact there are kind of neutral players in the F1 paddock who just amused by it, because it's just a classic example of F1 competition, just finding all those little things, teams needling each other, and you can be a little bit po-faced and spirit of the game about it, but this is what it's all about, isn't it? It's competition on the edge. How far are you willing to push it? It's just a great little snapshot of that mentality.
And it will be very interesting to see sort of how it plays out in this title run now, in the next few races, because not only do we have an increasingly interesting on-track fight as Verstappen drags himself more and more into the picture, and Red Bull have done a great job to turn things around. And this is where I have a little bit of sympathy for other people within Red Bull, because if it is individuals acting on their own. You know, Lauren Mekies, the team boss, has gone out of his way to stress the effort that has gone in at the factory, people behind the scenes on this. And this kind of thing kind of detracts from that a little bit. Like, rather than the story of the Red Bull Renaissance and Verstappen getting into the title fight, we're talking about this sort of thing. But as all of that plays out, it means that we've got some off-track shenanigans and, yeah, that little bit of tension rising to go with the on-track stuff. So I think all it means is that the final few races could just be more explosive than we could have imagined going into the summer break.
And that's the fantastic thing. We've got this three-way championship battle. It's going to ramp up. This is another layer to that whole fight. Who knows what could be the next step? Are we going to see new phases in the tape war? Are we going to see people putting their tape over other tape to cause problems? That's the kind of thing people will be thinking about. And that's one of the great things about Formula One, I think. This is a fantastic illustration of that. And it's going to be a talking point when we get to Mexico.